Nō mai, haere mai, welcome. I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. This week, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Russia. At the same time, Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida visited Ukraine. Is the Russian invasion of Ukraine deepening the divide in Asia? Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
Why were the leaders of the world's second and third largest economies making these visits this week?
Yes, what a fascinating coincidence. I think the Chinese one was always announced well in advance. So we know that Mr. Xi was going to support a somewhat isolated Mr. Putin in Moscow. I think that was a show of solidarity. And it took on a particular significance because shortly before Xi Jinping arrived, of course, Mr. Putin and his commissioner for children's affairs were both indicted by the International Criminal Court and faced legal charges, and also documents that would lead to their arrest if they go to countries of the 123 countries that signed up to the criminal court. So I think Xi's message was, to support Mr. Putin. And of course the Chinese, I suppose a bit of a nightmare scenario for China is for Mr. Putin to basically to be defeated in Ukraine. It's not that they agree with the invasion, it's just that now he's committed himself. They probably don't want to see Mr. Putin's regime collapse because that may have reverberations for the authoritarian regime in China. The Japanese ones, the visit to Ukraine, seemed to be a lot more improvised. We know that Mr. Kishida had come under pressure within domestic politics in Japan. Why? Well, Japan is hosting the G7 meeting this year, and he's the only member of the G7 group that hasn't visited Ukraine so far. And of course, Japan is a close ally of the United States. But I think there was another reason for Mr. Kishida going there, which has been largely obscured, and that is Japan is deeply disturbed by Chinese support, tacit support, for Mr. Putin's attempt to annex part of Ukraine. Why? Because Japan has a territorial dispute with Russia over the Kuril Islands, and the Kuril Islands have been have been the subject of dispute between Japan and Russia since the Second World War, and there's no resolution in sight. So they do not want to see Russia successfully annex part of Ukraine because they realise that would probably make the Russians even more intractable over the Kuril Islands. So I think there is a territorial dimension to this.
Is the war in Ukraine worsening relationships between Asian nations, or is it simply making those divisions more visible?
I don't think it's necessarily worsening relations between them. The tensions, as you indicated, the tensions between China and Japan have been ever present. It's always been a delicate relationship. The relationship has improved recently, but it's had its ups and downs. And of course, one of the biggest problems is that the Chinese feel that Japan has never really come to terms with its the excesses of the Japanese incursion into China in the past. And so I think there's some resentment there on the Chinese side towards Japan. But yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is the relationship really improved during the Trump years. Japan was not particularly impressed by Mr. Trump's policies towards China. They believed he was right in taking China, diagnosing that China was operating unfair trade practices. They thought he was wrong in the sort of methods he adopted in dealing with that problem. So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that the Ukraine is accentuating those differences, but it's certainly interesting because I'm surprised how far China has leaned in the direction of Mr. Putin. I think China's leadership is taking a great risk, and Japanese solidarity with Mr. Zelensky, of course, is much appreciated in Kyiv, and I think it's also the Japanese presence is complicating China's plans to present itself as a neutral peace broker, which it clearly isn't, because Mr. Xi's plan, which Mr. Putin said he would consider, of course he would consider it, because it calls for the removal of sanctions and also has no reference to China, to Russia withdrawing its troops from Ukraine.
You said you're surprised how far China's leaning towards Russia. You also talked about the danger to the Chinese regime if Russia failed. Are those two things linked?
Yes, I think they are. I think Xi feels under pressure. I think Chinese position towards Russia is conflicted. After all, Russia's policy of annexation or invasion, which is a breach of international law, is actually undermining China's foreign policy in relation to Taiwan, because its claim to Taiwan is based on what is called Chinese territorial integrity and also its sovereignty, whereas Mr. Putin didn't recognise the sovereignty of a neighbour, and so there's a tension there. But I suppose the other side of the coin is that, as we mentioned before, the Russian leadership is very worried about a leader they know well and who they've dealt with, and they've met 39, 40 times now, Xi and Putin. They are reluctant to see that leadership fail, because what may follow? Maybe it may be a more Western-leaning leadership in Russia. You don't know. I mean, and so I think they're conflicted. In a sense, Russia's action in Ukraine has put China on the spot, and China has tried to adopt a sitting on the fence ambivalent approach. But I think Japan, its presence in Kyiv, has to some extent made China's position much more difficult.
We've heard this week about another Kiwi soldier, Kane Tatai, who's been killed in Ukraine. And this was an individual cost, somebody who took a risk and paid a price. But what cost are Japan and China, the United States, Russia, New Zealand, everyone, what cost are countries willing to pay to get what they want out of this conflict in Ukraine? How far will this go?
Well, I think the scope for diplomacy, Bruce, is very limited. And from the Ukrainian point of view, I mean, they've lost significant large numbers of soldiers as well as civilians during the Russian occupation. And nothing less than the full liberation of their territory will suffice for them. And that seems to be the position of the United States and most backers of Ukraine. Mr. Putin's army is not prevailing, and also Ukraine is poised for a counter-offensive very soon, which they'll probably target Crimea. So how far are they going to go? There's lots of speculation that China was on the verge of arming Russia, and the Americans have accused China of considering that. The Chinese have vehemently denied that. But if the Chinese took that step, as we've discussed before, Xi would probably put his own leadership at risk, I think, because China would certainly be on the receiving end of sanctions in two of their most lucrative export markets, namely the US and EU. And that's been quite clearly spelt out to the Chinese leadership. So if he willingly took that step and then caused economic harm in China, I think he'd be vulnerable. There are other ambitious people within the ruling Chinese Communist Party who probably think they can do as good a job, if not better, than Xi. We should never lose sight of that. Just because it's a one-party state doesn't mean there's not political competition. So yeah, I mean, how far are these contenders going to go? My sense is there's little scope for diplomacy, and Mr. Putin would be wise to withdraw his troops. It would be very difficult for him to survive. But yeah, I suppose on reflection, that will be, there's no way out now for Putin, in the sense that he's committed himself, he shows no signs of backing down. If he's forced to retreat, then he will probably be the end of his political career. For the Ukrainians, there's nowhere to go. And they're certainly not going to allow the Russians to keep territory. So it's become like a a zero-sum game, a winners and losers. It doesn't seem to be any sort of win-win outcome to this.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Noho ora mai.